right, let's begin. Welcome to all of our attendees. And my name is Tressa Levasseur. I work at Vocalist International. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar presented by Vocalist International and Global Toronto. Global Toronto is a meeting place more than a marketplace, and it's encouraging challenging conversations guided by the theme, acknowledging opportunity and envisioning the future. And Vocalist is very thrilled to be partnering with you. A few things that we'll need to cover before we begin today's webinar. We recognize the complexity and privilege of gathering online today, and we would like to share a digital land acknowledgement written by Adrian Wong of the Spiderweb Show in Ontario, which was adapted for this webinar. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let us take a moment to acknowledge the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking that we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not necessarily readily available in many marginalized communities. And we invite everyone with us today to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our personal and structural roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accomplishment. When you open the webinar, a control panel appeared on your screen. If you're joining us from GoToWebinar, the link to access closed captioning is in the chat box here. You can hide the control panel if you're in GoToWebinar with the little orange arrow. Global Toronto has different ways of hiding their chat. To submit your questions for consideration, please use the questions menu in the control panel if you're joining us via GoToWebinar. And if not, please place them in the chat box on Global Toronto, and one of the organizers will make sure that we get those questions. There'll be a live Q&A at the end of today's webinar, around the 50-minute mark. For our content today, we'll mostly be answering questions submitted in advance. And after the webinar, for those of us joining us from Global Toronto, there will be breakout sessions. The discussion topics for those sessions will be shared with all of our viewers today, regardless of whether you've registered for them or not. And you can download in the handouts section the full slideshow for today's webinar, which include those prompts that you're invited to work on yourself. A recording and a transcript of this webinar will be posted online in the coming days on Vocalist's YouTube channel, and a link to that will be sent out to all of our registrants by the end of the week. And if you are joining us via GoToWebinar, a survey will launch at the end of today. We would love for you to fill it out, specifically topics you'd like to see us cover in future webinars, so that we can respond to what you'd like to see. Okie dokie, let's launch a little poll. And hey, folks at Global Toronto, make sure to put it in the chat box over there too. What is your industry role? So please select one of the following: artist, arts organization, industry, presenter, or other. This is just going to help us to understand who's in the room with us today and orient our conversation. Oh, wow, we got a lot of presenters here today. This is exciting. Fantastic. Okie dokie. It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator and the brains behind this awesome offering. A board member of Vocalist International, a very compelling artist, someone who runs an organization in Kansas City called As Mentorship, and just an all-around really cool human that I've loved collaborating with. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Enrique Chi.
Hey, thank you all for having me. This is going to be a really fun conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So as we start this conversation, the spirit of this is to try to think through what were the steps that led us in our journeys into being activists and aligning that with our artistic path, the lessons that we've learned. I think that as anybody that goes through a journey like this, you pick up things along the way. A lot of it is more experiential and you can't really be put into a book, but perhaps there's a few things that through the little stumbles and bumps and bruises that maybe we've had along the journey that we can help save you all a few steps in that process by giving our perspective. So we're grateful that you all are here. And I want to start out by just asking the panelists that we have here on in the discussion, and I'll answer the question myself first. The question is this: was there a specific moment, a point in your artistic journey and or your life in general where you realize, I want to use activism, I want to use that as part of my practice? And for me, it was actually the moment I met Juan Carlos, who's the percussionist of making movies. And as I was at a community event that a not-for-profit hosted, and they had folkloric dancers, Mexican folkloric dancers, and then folks who were doing young kids who were doing art as well. And I talked to the organizer, and I met Juan Carlos's mother, who was doing the folkloric dance group, and she's like, yeah, I've been doing this group so that kids, when they immigrate to the United States, they can feel proud of their culture. And then I saw the artwork the kids were making, and I remembered the feeling that I had when I was 6 years old, moving to the United States. And I asked the director of that organization, can I come volunteer and just, I know how to play music, maybe I can help and just hang out with these young people who have just moved to the United States. And in that moment, having met Juan Carlos's mother, that later created the band that we formed, Making Movies, that was the moment where I realized, for me, the music that we would make also had this second purpose, or maybe its first purpose, and then we make the music. I'm not sure. At different points, it switches direction, but that moment I realized we can impact young people, and just like they're using dance to create empowerment and feel proud, maybe we could use music. And that light bulb turned on that day, and it's never turned off since. So in this moment, I'd like to pass the mic to Gina. Is there a moment, Gina, where you felt that way, where you felt that was a pivotal moment in realizing you wanted to do activism?
Sure. So for me, so I have a nonprofit called Niñas Arriba, and it's a college fund for young women in El Salvador. And so honestly, the moment for me was my wife and I actually, before we got married, we're both Catholic. We love, we wanted to do mission work outside of the country. And so basically we signed up with this Catholic volunteer program and said, send us somewhere in the world, ideally Spanish speaking, because both of us are Latinas, but we didn't grow up speaking Spanish. And so it just felt like a real connection. And so we got sent to El Salvador, and it was life-changing to be in Soyapango, El Salvador, which is a gang-dominated part of San Salvador. It's, if you've heard of La Mara Salvatrucha or the MS-13 gang, this is essentially their stronghold. This is where MS-13 was born. And so it's a very dangerous part of El Salvador. Guidebooks tell you not to go there. And here's, two estadounidenses like in Soyapango. So anyway, it was a really formative experience. We lived there for 8 months. We taught English to girls in an all-girls school that was run by nuns, that was aimed at giving a quality education at a very low cost. Most good education in El Salvador you do have to pay for. And so they basically, try to make it so that it's a super low cost, but gives a good education. And so at the end of our time, it just felt so wrong to be like, cool, okay, we're done. Like, good luck with your life. We're going back to the first world. It just felt so wrong after having been so connected to these young women, to the nuns. And so Jody, my wife, she was like, what if we started a college scholarship fund? And so we talked to some of the young women in our senior class, and we said, hey, who wants to go to college? And like, everybody raises their hand. And we're like, who's going to college? And everybody drops their hand. And so of course we start talking about it, and you're talking about a culture that it's not prioritized for young women to get a secondary, to get higher education. It's not a country that, where there's a lot of, they're going to like prioritize funding for that. And so of course, all these young women wanted to continue their education, but there was no money for it. So we basically were like, okay, well, let's start a college scholarship fund. How do we raise money? Well, let's do it through music. So that was kind of, it was almost like the only way that we had to raise money was through music. But I think that the pivotal moment was just being involved in a community where we went to go help, and honestly, we received so much more love than we ever could have given, that it feels like this was like a natural outpouring to say, we need to continue this relationship and do something.
I love that story. That's an amazing story, and I think that's how it works, right? You have an eye-opening moment, and you realize, well, now I can't turn back. I'd like to bring Denise into the conversation. Gina is a good friend too. We met years ago, and happy to be doing work together. Denise is also a friend. I actually have subbed in Denise's band Las Cafeteras, so I've had the opportunity, the blessing of being on the road with them, and I'm seeing the power in Denise's work. So giving a little praise in this, because I've actually experienced it firsthand when they do workshops or like kind of like community events. Denise has an amazing gift at sharing her perspective with people. So I'm excited to bring you into the conversation.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for sharing space and for having the conversation around how artists can create social change and healing in our communities. I, with my compadres in Las Cafeteras, have a different story. You know, we actually met doing community work and activism, and so this is how our journey began before we even started playing music. It was probably the mid-2000s when we gathered in a space called the Eastside Cafe, which is a community space in Northeast LA, proud East LA seeds, where we started talking about the power of telling our own stories, right? So we started learning this music called Son Jarocho, which in those days was something new and exciting in LA, but also a seed of information. There's Black Mexicans, there's an indigenous Black root in Mexico we never knew about. And as Chicanas and Chicanos in LA, there's a strong essence of going back to the root and finding ourselves, right? And finding our voice. And with the music, we started having language. With the dancing, we started having language of telling and reimagining our own stories. What are we Chicanas and Chicanos from East LA? How do we arrive in a world where we claim our stories, where we're the ones that are saying who we are rather than having a politic imposed on us, right? And so when we started understanding that there's a relationship with how we grew up, with our immigrant parents feeling silence and us then having kind of a hesitance to arrive in the world in a very proud way, we decided that music was only a vehicle and a tool for us to be able to make these connections all over the country and outside of the country. We were very surprised. Most of us never even imagined this to be our life. I didn't. And so when you couple and marry this idea of expressiveness as a person of color, as a young Chicana who grew up in a working class community, when I marry that with understanding that me expressing myself is a political act, where me stating what I want in my life is not only a manifestation, right, but is also a protest and breaking out of a mold that was built for me and imposed on me, it becomes a very powerful thing. And so I find that the joy is radical. I find that self-love is political, right? And I find that it's a duty for us to break the idea, the imagination of what it means to be Mexican, to be Chicana, to be Black, indigenous, person of color, to be queer in this country, right? It's a duty for us to do it with whatever tools we have. And Las Cafeteras and myself, I have it through music. I have it through dancing, right? And so I don't know if there was an actual time when we said, hey, this is the moment. I think it just was infused in what we did. And then suddenly music came into our lives.
I love that story. Yeah, you all were activists first, like the way that Hector tells the story. Hector's another band member with Denise, or maybe it's Jose that tells the story. Jose is the drummer. He's like, Hector has this really loud voice, and they were at a protest, and it's like, hey man, you have a really loud voice, and I have a drum. Come over here, we can make something happen. So
you find who's around me, who can be loud with me, right? I'm loud with my movement, with their voices and their drumming. So yeah.
That's another beautiful story. Thank you for sharing, Denise. And now I'd like to introduce Beny. Beny, we have not met till this moment, so I'm really excited to hear your story. Tell us a little bit more about how this work became a part of your life.
Yes, nice to meet you, Enrique, and it's an honor to be in this panel. Yes, I mean, I would say being an activist and doing community work and doing music that is socially conscious has been a part of my life since I was a baby. My parents are both artists, educators, and human rights activists from Colombia. My grandparents also were very involved with doing community work and doing work in the building of communities in Colombia, where I was born. And we had, as a result of all of that, I guess legacy is something that I grew up in. I grew up in that context. When I was a kid, I would follow my parents, and they'd be doing workshops in the outskirts of Bogota to you know, raise funds to build housing for people that didn't have a place to live. So it's almost like I never had a choice, really. That's been the context that I grew up in. So in the late 80s, we had to leave Colombia as political refugees, and we had to come to Toronto. It was a really difficult time in Colombia. Probably one of the most difficult. If you all are familiar with the history of Colombia, it's been a country that's been through a lot of civil war. So we had to leave at the peak of that. And we arrived in Toronto, and the first people who took us in was the community that was already here, the Colombian community that had also come for similar reasons. So it was also in that context where I began to find myself as a musician and as an artist, and it was in that context that I began to have my first opportunities to perform and to showcase my music. So you know, I grew up going to events with my parents, solidarity events, to protests, to marches, and it was in that space that I was able to start performing, create my music, and start finding opportunities for gigs and all of that. I would say, you know, so I would say the pivotal moment, which relates to the work that I'm currently doing, happened while I was teaching. I was running a recording program, a music recording program in Jane and Finch community, which is a highly racialized community in Toronto. A lot of Latinos, a lot of people from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, and it's a densely populated community in Toronto. And access to community studios is something that is not really available. And as you all know, it's probably what costs the most for people to be able to pay studio time. So, you know, I started a program there where I began to teach beat making, because a lot of the artists were just getting instrumentals from YouTube and writing lyrics on top of the instrumentals. So at the end, they wouldn't own their music. So I began with, you know, beat making workshops, then how to create an album cover, how to you know, do a press release, and the final culminating project was to release their album. So this was in a nonprofit organization that was funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which is a, you know, a big foundation that gives out grants to nonprofits. In the middle of the second cohort, it was supposed to be a 3-year program. The organization, which was the board of directors, were really wealthy landowners in Toronto. They were part of the board of directors, and there were different programs where the employees decided to unionize because the working conditions were really terrible at the time. So, you know, we got together, we began to learn about the process of unionizing a nonprofit, and everything, you know, everybody was in agreement. We signed the cards, and we got you know, the cards signed. As soon as the executive director found out and the board of directors found out, they did everything in their power to try to stifle the union. And what ended up, to make a long story short, they shut down the program prematurely, and about 30 youth were left on the street without being able to complete their program. Now, this made many of the youth become politicized and learn, and including us, learn about the process of unionization, the issues that were going on in the community with the lack of access to these programs, and just how all of that, the funding worked. A lot of different protests were organized. And we were basically, we had to go to court. We went to court for about 10 months. It was crazy. We ended up winning and proving that we were fired due to the organization having anti-union animus. And but the program did not get reinstated because, of course, if an organization doesn't want a program, they just want to apply for the funding, and so the program didn't become reinstated. So as a result of that, I began my own sort of project with a couple of the youth that were a part of the program, where we created a mobile studio recording program. So now space wasn't an issue. And in this community, it is very divided into neighborhoods due to over-policing, and also or people have fear of traveling from one neighborhood to the other due to over-policing, but also gang-related issues. So what the program does is we go one day to the south of the community and get youth to record, taking mobile equipment. And then on another day of the week, we go to the north side. Now, the north and the south are divided in that sense. So the whole purpose is to create collaboration between the two neighborhoods, and we're already on our second cycle, and it's been really successful. So I would say it was during my community work that my dedication to community work and activism through the arts became I guess the strongest.
Beny, what a powerful story. And the work you're doing is incredibly important. Thank you for doing that. As we think about this, these are all really long stories. Like the story that I told, that was 11 years ago, when this work started for us. And Beny, it sounds like from your narrative too, it's been a lot of years developing this. And I want to kind of get back to the root, to the beginning of how these things started. And it would be a lie to say that any of us, I would guess, but I'll speak for myself specifically, that we really designed all this beautifully. Like 10, 11 years ago, we sat down and we're like, hold on, I got it. If I do this, and then it'll all come together. There's a moment in my journey, and you kind of have to accept that let the magic happen before your eyes. But we had already started a not-for-profit organization. This is 7, 8 years into the journey of that moment where I said, can I volunteer? Developed the music camp, developed into this. Our band was making records. We had put out a second record with Steve Berlin of Los Lobos on production, and we're starting to tour internationally. And we're at the first step of building a national and international career. And at that moment, Ruben Blades, who is my hero of all songwriters in the world, says, I really love your band at the Latin Grammys and wants to collaborate. We make a song called, well, he says, send me the lyrics of your record. I want to know what you're writing about. And then when he makes this song with us called No Te Calles, which means don't be silenced, raise your voice. It's almost as if he wrote the mantra or the mission statement for my artistic journey, because here we are creating an arts organization to empower young people to raise their voice. And now my band gets to sing a song written by my hero about raising your voice. No, I did not put this into a journal 10 years ago and say, hold on, we got this, if we could design this. But that being said, there is intention and design that did go into it at different parts of the journey. And I remember a moment 2 years ago where I always felt like my wheels were spinning and I didn't know which direction to go. And I had a meeting with one of my mentors. But just a little aside, keep amazing mentors close in your life if you have them. For all this work, there's definitely people who've gone down the path before you, and they usually are eager to guide those along. But I had this moment, and my mentor, she sat down with me, and she just brought a journal to the meeting, and she said, just take a day off, go home and journal, set your intention. And that was profound. So I want to discuss this with you, Gina. In this moment, at what points in your journey did you set the intention of the work you were doing? You told us how you got the heartstrings pulled to say, I got to do something. Did you and your wife sit down and say, all right, these are our goals? Maybe tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's great that you talk about, it's so funny because even just the defining intent and designing the map, we're kind of in the same boat, where I think on some level, the biggest takeaway I would say for people is just move, just do something, because, yes, there are intentions, but I think it's movement begets movement. you know? And so for us, I actually say the intention started when we went to El Salvador. So that was probably the hardest thing, was stopping our lives in Austin in order to go to El Salvador. At the time, I had finally gotten a band together. I was starting to like make moves in Austin, you know, and starting to get a little bit of a name going. And so everybody was telling me, this is stupid. You shouldn't go. This is dumb. And something about it, we were just like, I don't know why, but we just have to. You know, it was like really listening to our inner knowing and just understanding it doesn't make sense here, but we have to go, you know? And I can't explain it to you, but we're getting out of here, you know? And then the hardest part, like I said, was stopping our lives in Austin. And then once we got to El Salvador, that obviously was a whole other experience. But I think the intention actually started there, right? And we had no idea what was going to come out of it would be a college fund that 10 years later I'd be talking about on a panel, and we would have 100% graduation rate, being able to support young women in El Salvador who are more than deserving, but just needed a champion. You know, so that's just to say, like, we were curious, we followed our intuition, and like that's such a big piece of that journey. And then I would say once we decided to start a college fund and had no idea what we were doing, you know, we were kind of like, well, how do we raise money? And it really was just like, well, I'm a musician, let's throw benefit concerts. And again, there wasn't necessarily like a bunch of intent to it. It was more just like, well, this is a pathway, let's do this and see what happens, you know. And a big piece of it too, Enrique, that you talked about was identifying people along the way who could be mentors or champions of you or your cause, you know. And so we randomly, I had been featured on NPR. You know what? I think it was at the Folk Alliance. I had a bio. This is funny, I hadn't thought about this. So I think I was playing at Folk Alliance just as a solo artist, and in my bio, I had something about my experience in El Salvador. So this guy comes up to me afterwards, and he's like, hey, I run a house concert series on the East Coast. I don't know if y'all know David Holiday of Stone Room Concerts. But he was like, I used to live in El Salvador for 10 years. I work on Latin America in my job. And like, he basically is Salvadoran, you know, but looks like Santa Claus. And anyway, and so like he essentially became our champion in order to really make Niñas Arriba a reality. And so again, it's just these things that like never would have, you can't necessarily plan them, but if you're following your own intention and connecting with people and not being afraid to reach out, you know, Enrique, I can't think enough about how like here Ruben Blades says something about you, but then y'all took the momentum to say, great, let's do something together. Whereas I think a lot of artists would be like, oh my God, my hero reached out to me, and that was the end of the story. You know what I mean? So I think it takes like just kind of moving from step to step in order to make something happen. I mean, I don't have a ton of wisdom other than that. You know, I think there is obviously, as our project has grown, you start to have to think more about, okay, now we need to get a board of directors together. Now we need to like, you know, bring more people into the project. Okay, our young women have graduated. Are we doing a second cohort? And so of course you have to start like being more intentional about what is the project now. We don't live in El Salvador anymore. You know, we don't know the young women that we're reaching out to. So how do we find new people? And so you have to obviously like problem solve and be able to grow. But I do think for people starting out, the big thing is, you know, follow your curiosity and your intention, and it will lead you to beautiful places.
I love that. I love that. And I also love the cameo by Denise's cat. Beautiful. What I was hearing, Gina, as I was listening to you speak, is that what you're saying is that setting intention is a journey. It's that you don't arrive at setting intention. You continually reassess your intention, and you go, okay, now we have grown past this stage. Now, what would be the next logical step? And that combined with the right mentors is a recipe for success. You know, however you define success, but I think it's very successful that you have put young women through school in another country. That's an amazing feat, as just as a human feat to accomplish that. So I love hearing that, and we need to move very quick, as there's a lot of subjects to speak on. But I think it would be wise to allow Denise and Beny, if you have any other things to reference to intention. To me, this is the most important piece, perhaps because of just where I'm at in my journey. I realized that I underappreciated the power of like mind mapping or setting real intention, taking downtime. I felt like downtime was wasted time, like, and setting intention time feels downtime-ish. Like, I'm gonna drink a cup of coffee and journal what I want to make happen. That sounds really relaxed. Denise, Beny, do you have any other comments towards setting intention and designing your map? Because I think it is something that we've all touched. It's all affected us.
Well, Las Cafeteras, we actually are rooted down as community organizers. So if there's anything we can do is organize ourselves. The art is the hard part for us. So we actually started doing, we would have, sorry, my cat's just like me. We actually would have monthly meetings and retreats where we would talk about what's the impact we wanted to make. We knew the impact the music made on us, and we were starting to get kind of momentum. You know, people were starting to hear about our work, and at first we didn't really understand the impact, right? And so what we did understand was goals. What we did understand was outreach, and so we would have short-term goals, long-term goals, and objectives. We would have 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years, right? And we would talk about dreaming, right? We would do like, what are the dreams? Where do we want to arrive at? And it was a plethora of dreams, because in that time, there was a lot more of us. There was, I think there was like 20 people when we just started playing music, and it came down to committees. We had an education committee. This education committee was in charge of doing workshops, of gathering connections from Mexico, and whenever they were in town, making sure that we had somewhere where they would stay, that we had a calendar of events for them to be able to make money, and that we would support the work that they did, right? So it's kind of a transnational relationship building. We also had a community building committee where we talked about who's playing Son Jarocho. Yes.
Denise, this is your band. You just know how strange that is. Like, that is like the most, like, it's amazing. Like, that you were so intentional with your band.
Yeah, we had education committee, community building, where we like, who are the folks playing this music in California, in the States, right? And how do we make connections with them? We had a like communications committee, right? So these turned into departments later in our journey, where before these were just committees, and everyone was in every committee because we all wanted to do everything, right? And so it was very much about making sure our souls were okay by playing the music, having conversations around identity. What does it mean for Chicanas? What chose us to be playing music that we don't really understand, because our level of understanding the Spanish language really varied, right? Some folks never spoke Spanish in their homes, and we're now singing in Spanish. Other folks, you know, like myself, my parents only allowed Spanish in the home. And so it was a lot. It was a lot. And so for us, we're like, well, what's the point, right? Is the point just that we feel good when we play music? People are starting to want to hire us. Do we want to be hired musicians? And in that, you know, conversation, it sprouted. Some folks did not. So only stayed, you know, home, making sure that folks that were coming through the Eastside Cafe were still learning. We're still talking about the roots of Black Mexico, around silence and marginalization. And then there's folks that said, hey, we're down to leave the lives that we built here and start touring, right? And make an impact that way. And with that came, you know, the talk about, is this now a career? Is this now how we make money? And what does that mean, right? To take roots of activism and cultura and now put a money sign on it.
And you merged that beautifully with the next subject. How do you create these containers in your in your artistic life that you can manifest ways to compensate yourself. And what are you comfortable getting paid for? And what are you not comfortable getting paid for? To me, that and setting the intention and designing your map are two parts of the same spirit, right? Of really, really being intentional and being organized. You all are organized as like to a level that musicians never are. Like I've met no one that has that level of tenacity and organizational skills. So Beny, as I bring you in, you know, feel free to take this where you feel it's most appropriate for your journey. Where did you design intention, and in that intention, how did you look at, okay, this is something I want to get paid for, this is something I want to do just because it's beautiful and it's art for me, and how do those merge, and how do you separate them? What are these containers? I think that's what the meaning of that containers, like, all right, this is a separate space and I keep it that way.
Yes, okay, so I always use this phrase, which helps me out a lot, and it's respect what you expect. And in terms of setting intentions, I use the word expectations, right? So in a community context, for example, what is my goal? My goal is to preserve the community, and by preserving the community, you have to preserve the people within the community. You have to preserve the individuals in order to preserve the community. So that is my end goal. So for example, to use the example of the story that I told you about the mobile studio, we knew that there was this need that needed to be filled because we were without our program. So the next thing was that was the biggest thing. The goal was to replace it with a better program. So, you know, the next thing is to set a date for you to accomplish your goal, and then you do the steps that you need to meet that goal, and then it's just action. You just need to diligently follow it, and that's kind of what has helped me be able to accomplish the goals that I set. How it's related with manifesting compensation in a community context and as an activist, I think it's important to set the example. So we all agree that it's important for our movements to have culture. Culture is super important, and it needs to be at the forefront of all social movements. It's a way to resist in a peaceful way that is never passive. It allows you to communicate ideas that you can't do through other means, that you can't do through words, or that you can't do through certain type of organizing. So culture is very important. But a lot of the times we're not being compensated, and we are the community. So how can you preserve the community if you're not preserving the artists that are the people bearing that culture and that are the people in the forefront of that community? So it's important when we're organizing to be able to say, listen, we're gonna have artists, that we're gonna have a cultural component in this rally or this protest or this event, but it's important for us to acknowledge the artists by paying them, because we need to make sure that they're good. We need to make sure that the artists are good in order for us to be able to have a healthy community and to preserve our community and to preserve our movement. So it's important for us to set that example when we're on the role of the organizers. That way, when we also are asked by other organizations to come to these events, to also be compensated fairly, so that we can continue to do the work that we do, so that we continue to make these songs that are relevant to these movements. So I would say that's been my experience, and sometimes obviously there's events where, you know, there is no money. So that's not necessarily just because you know, you can get paid in other ways, not necessarily by you know, monetarily, but for example, a lot of the grassroots events that I performed that where I haven't, you know, I know for a fact that the organizers can't pay, I'm still 100% down with performing and doing what I do because I believe in the cause. But then you know, I asked the organizers to help to support me in other ways. And for example, when I did a CD release, both CD releases that I've done for my albums, including the one that was really successful, it was nominated for a Juno. I reached out to a lot of these organizations and they said, listen, I know you have a huge network of people that you know, resonate with the music that I do. Can you help me promote? And hands down, everybody was down to do that. And the reason why I felt it was really successful and I got a really good turnout was because everybody who I had supported prior to all of that, I asked for their support and they were more than willing to do it. So sometimes we also got to see that compensation doesn't come in the way of money as well.
I really appreciate that. The organization that we founded, As Mentorship, we have a policy to always pay artists. Simultaneously to that, what you're describing is that this realization that money, and I'm stealing this from Angus, the director of Focal Alliance, he said this to me recently, I thought it was a really clear way to describe it. Money is just one form of energy, right? It's like gives fuel to the machine, and we need it. We can't pay rent without money, but there's other forms of energy, and sometimes if you just are creative or are bold enough to ask, you can get that back. I think Las Cafeteras, I've spoken to you all, or I actually learned a lot from you all about that. You all always leverage when you're doing something for the community. You say, okay, I know that you all don't have money, but there's other resources that we can tap into, which might just be, you know, just maybe just getting the word out about an event that can turn into money, right? Because this could be tickets sold to help put the literal and metaphorical fuel in the gas tank of the machine that is Las Cafeteras. So I love all these perspectives, and I think it leads us to this question. At what point do you decide, like Beny, you have a very clear path of, you've started these organizations. Denise, you all have not started a not-for-profit, yet you've run the band with the level of organization almost as if it was a not-for-profit with committees and things. And Gina, you have started a fund within one, and I have started a not-for-profit. So I want to kind of open this up and let whoever feels inclined to speak first. What do you feel about the difference between grassroots engagement versus actually developing your own organization? Maybe Denise, explain to me what you all have chosen a path, having seen both. What was your reason for that choice for Las Cafeteras?
You know, I don't know if we've actually had a conversation around that. I think some of us, like Hector, did come from a nonprofit, a job. I used to work at a state school running a gender and sexuality center. I think for us, because the Eastside Cafe and our work was really rooted in the Zapatista framework, autonomous pathways to power in our own communities, the lack of being codependent on governmental sources of monetary, you know, gifts, being able to decide what kind of relationships we're building. You know, I don't know if we've even arrived at those conversations. What I do know is that it's taken us a long time to be able to be okay with even charging, right? To understand that if I am not well, I am no good to the movement. And sometimes having a nice hotel, not sleeping like sardines, having health insurance, being able to pay for health insurance. I think for us, the point of what we do is to be helpful to our folks, to our community, and that we don't necessarily need to have an actual organization to do that, because we marry our work as artists, you know, artivism. We do have residencies where that actually compensates most of the work that we do with the community, right? We engaged a lot in like the sanctuary movement. We are able to be the microphone for a lot of folks who may not have access to a wider audience. And so I think that we are not ready to limit ourselves. And I think there's also a little bit of fear, right? Coming from places of institution that guide principles and ideologies, I think that we don't necessarily think we need to go that route, right? If the Zapatistas did it in this way, in a free way, in an autonomous way, in a way that's horizontally structured, can we also do that and not necessarily create a new and another institution, right?
That's
and
a really
so yeah, and
interesting
so
point, Denise.
we're just like, we have not talked about it. I don't think there's a need to institutionalize the work that we do. I think that we're able to intellectualize a politicized experience, and with that, I think create relationships, right, where folks feel empowered to build in their own communities, to be the voice of their story and their people, and to imagine how to build that legacy, rebuild it, right? Reimagine, rebuild, and not necessarily in an institutionalized way.
I love that, and I'll speak to it too. I chose to actually start a not-for-profit, and it's because we had started a music camp through a not-for-profit, kept trying to grow it, and realized that the interest didn't align enough with the organization, and I reluctantly started a not-for-profit. I didn't want to. I thought this is going to be a lot of work, and I would say it is a lot of work. But 2 years later, after if you're going to do that path, you got to be down for a couple of years of just infrastructure building. Learning the language of the not-for-profit, and it'll feel like, wow, I'm doing so much work that has nothing to do with the original cause. But I've actually come through the other side. I'm at year 3, and I'm like, oh, now I get why all that work has value. And so we got to move really quick. So I'm moving into mistakes and lessons learned. I don't want to limit Beny and Gina, your voices on the difference between grassroots versus starting an organization. So maybe if you can answer to your perspectives on lessons learned about grassroots or not-for-profit, if there's something you'd like to speak up to that. But I think that I'll open up this section like mistakes and lessons learned. If I would go back in time, I would have made more boundaries for myself, boundaries within my own time, my own downtime, and what I am willing to do, like Beny said, things I'm willing to do for free, things I'm willing to get compensated for, and been a little more organized about it, and made more of those reflection moments and not considered downtime like I'm wasting energy. So that's the thing that I think that would be my biggest lessons learned. What are some mistakes that you feel have taught you some things along the way?
I think for myself, I think one of the lessons has been the offerings and the gifts that you present to your audience and to your community also needs to be internal. So take care of the health and the relationships internally with your band, with whoever you're working with, so that you are, what's the saying, you can't pour out of an empty cup, right? And so no te tienes que matar, you don't have to, the sacrifice doesn't have to leave you like a noodle, like all like tirado, you know. It's something that I think I've learned. You don't have to be a martyr to make an impact. And so take care of your health, take care of your heart and the people around you, so that you can last longer, so that you can be stronger, and so that you can repair and heal any trauma, any ancestral trauma, and really understand that those do make an impact, and that there's always somebody watching, right? Young people are watching us, because for a lot of our communities, we're pioneers in doing what we do, right? We might be the only band that looks like us or sounds like us in a festival, and that is a big deal, especially for young people, right? Especially for queer folk, for women. So somebody's always watching.
Agreed. Beny, in your journey, are there any lessons that you've learned recently? And I will ask us to speed up the pace because I want to get to a bunch of questions that they have coming up. Is there something that comes to mind that you'd like to share?
I would say related to the previous question, just I worked as an arts administrator for nonprofits, and that's where I began that program that I told you about. While I was juggling being a father and doing my own career and doing my own compositions and my own music. So the whole, what Denise was talking about, the whole aspect of self-care was really important. And it was all of these things, especially working in a nonprofit, it's a lot of work, a lot of administrative work. So the whole self-care aspect was lacking in my life. So once I got out of that nonprofit, because of the reasons that I got out of it, I decided to be a full-time self-employed artist, and I decided to open up this mobile studio as a collective, not as a nonprofit, which is different in Canada. You don't have as many options in terms of applying for funding and stuff like that, but the administrative work is a lot less, I would say, even though it's still, you know, there's still a lot of work. So that allowed me to have more time to focus on my own musical projects and to focus on my family. So I would say, you know, just be able to juggle things, but don't let it get in the way of your health, because that's the priority. You need to be in good health to be able to be there for your community, to be there for your family, and to be there for all your projects.
I love that. And as I pass the mic to Gina, this ties into what you spoke to earlier and a chat question. You said that you learned a lot of lessons by empowering this Santa Claus gentleman that became a mentor for you. So the question is this, you know, how did you learn the lesson of identifying and reaching the members of community that you want to serve help and seeking out those allies to collaborate with? So how did you figure that out? How did you figure out this is an ally to collaborate with? What were the things that led you to those answers?
I mean, I think it's just when people present interest. You know, obviously David was a very special case, and you know, he had his own nonprofit. He's actually our fiscal sponsor, so we don't have an actual 501c3, and part of that is because David almost came in and provided the infrastructure, so we didn't have to like deal with it, basically. You know, at some point we probably should go ahead and start our own not-for-profit, but up until this point that has been great. And like, you know, anyway, so I think he kind of provided a doorway to get into, so where we could actually help the young women that we lived with in El Salvador without having to be like, I don't want this process to last for 2 years and then we miss out on the opportunity to help these young women now. You know, and I think as far as, so I think for identifying people, I mean, part of it is ask. You have to ask. And this actually, I was going to say my mistakes and lessons learned. I'm very much like, I'm in my late 30s and I'm just now starting to understand how small I have made myself throughout my life. And I think that also goes to, Denise, something you were saying that, you know, I think there's this assumption that in order to like do something good for the community, you have to like martyr yourself and never ask for money and sleep on a floor and like you know, on some level, I just feel like that's a complete misunderstanding of what we're doing. You know, we don't ever ask that of a for-profit company. You know, we don't ever question, oh, why are they investing in advertising? You know, and on the same level, the understanding that you get out what you put in. And so if you've put no money into the thing, how can you get out, you know? So it's like, if I don't invest in a website for my nonprofit, you know, or for my cause, then how can I expect for people to come find me? Like those kinds of things, right? And so if I'm gonna go play for an event and somebody's asking me to play for free, you know, you also have to beg the question, okay, what are they spending on the actual event space? What are they spending on food? Oh, okay, they're spending money. It's not that they don't have money, but there's some kind of idea out there that musicians should play for free. You know, and so I think it's just starting to like, just question it. I'm not saying that you can't go do something for free out of the goodness of your heart. Like, of course, I've done so many of those, but I'm also on the other side of it where I'm like, I have to feed myself. I have to feed my band. I have to take care of my people. And yeah, we're all at the age now where we're not going to sleep on a floor. Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, just understanding that like, that doesn't mean you're making yourself small. In fact, that's saying I'm worth it. I'm going to provide a great, you know, like workshop for your people. We're going to build the community and it's worth your investment because we're investing when we give ourselves.
I love that. And I think that ties to another question. So what are other ways, other than hiring artists, people of color and activists, what are other ways that presenters can help fuel the movement? And I think being a part of these conversations is a huge part of it, but I'd love to hear what Denise or Beny have to say about what presenters can do to help fuel the movement, aside from just hiring artists.
Something that we always make sure to do is make sure that venues that are hiring us also have a relationship with the local university and also local organization, community organization. So what I have found is that they exist in different worlds, right? And so sometimes presenters they're like, how do we get, you know, Spanish speaking people to our shows? We have our subscribers, and then we have folks that really would connect with your music, but they're not coming to our venue, you know? And so we usually say, well, they can't afford the show. So can you have a program where they get sponsored? Or can you, with the residencies that we do, if students come, can you have one of their family members come for free? And so we also are very much in this understanding. The reality is that our folks in our communities that would like to come to our shows and be empowered by our shows, one, there's no connection, right? So how are you connecting to the local folks who connect to the music and the artistry? Because we're not just entertainment, we're actual people with lived experiences that connect with lived experiences of the folks you're trying to outreach to. So what is the outreach plan? How are you making real connections that are meaningful and that are longstanding? How are you open to receiving feedback for folks who don't necessarily come to your shows, right? And so I think there needs to be space for vulnerability and for challenging oneself when it comes to presenting also a show, right? Because it's all connected. It's not just a venue presenting an artist. It's like, what is the artist talking about? Who does it connect with? If the folks that connect with that artist don't come to your shows regularly, why? Right? And the easiest thing I think is to connect with universities, and students are generally who come to our shows are first generation students, right? And so it's like making these like point A to point B to point C, and really being part of this relationship building plan.
That's great. So outreach, conversations, and relationship building within the community, so that when you do bring an artist to present, there's actually a network and a fabric. That's a wonderful note to end on. There was one last question that I think I will have to answer very quickly. How has, in this world that's changed, the COVID and the virtual world, how has it affected impact? You know, for me, it's actually well, it's made some challenges because not everybody has technology. Not all the young people are trying to have that technology to get on webinars, but the ability to have these conversations has been a huge benefit. That's not geographically centered conversations. We can talk to people from different parts of the world. So that's a beautiful thing. Our organization is hosting a conversation every Tuesday night called the Rebel Song Academy Live, and that has been one of the biggest lessons and one of the biggest things that we've learned through this time. All right, I'll pass the mic back.
All right, well, as you can see on the screen, for those of you who are here, we do have the breakout room prompts. These will be the prompts that will guide the discussions in the breakout rooms happening at Global Toronto. But for those of you who are not joining us over there, please consider answering these questions yourselves, and you can always get in touch with us at Folk Alliance to let us know what your answers are. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar presented by Folk Alliance International and Global Toronto. A huge muchas gracias to all of our panelists today, Gina Chavez, Enrique Chi, Denise Carlos, Beny Esguerra. Thank you so much. What a motivating and beautiful conversation this is. Please remember to download the handouts that are attached to the webinar with links. There's a link in the chat box to all of our other webinars available on our YouTube channel. Please take a moment to provide feedback about today's webinar by responding to the brief survey that will appear when this webinar ends. Stay safe, stay connected, community, and we will see you all next time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all, really appreciate it.
Gracias.
Thanks so much, y'all.